The Allied advance into France following D-Day was a headlong rush. It was a strategic necessity that pushed the young American tankers of the 3rd Armored Division to the very limits of human endurance. They had leapfrogged the French countryside, covering astonishing distances, yet the speed of the advance did not diminish the terror of the engagement. As the German forces, battered and disorganized, were forced to retreat and regroup through Belgium, the Americans knew they were chasing a wounded yet still lethal animal. The psychological edge was constantly held by the enemy's superior engineering. American tank crews lived with the knowledge that the frontal armor of their Shermans, a mere 3.5 inches, was often useless. It was useless against the massive 5.7-inch steel hide of the German Panther. The Panther's 75mm gun packed a quarter more destructive punch than their own. This technological disparity bred a gnawing anxiety. It was a fear that victory relied more on luck and flanking maneuvers than on direct confrontation. It was this potent mixture of exhaustion, fear, and technical disadvantage that would draw the focus of future historians. The story of this conflict is often told through the lens of generals and grand offensives, but it truly hinges on the experiences of the young men inside those steel boxes. The meticulous effort to recover these voices began decades later. It was sparked by the persistence of one man. Pete Semenoff, a veteran who understood the weight of these untold stories, repeatedly introduced the author, Adam Makos, to the reluctant hero at the center of the conflict. That hero was Clarence Moyer. Semenoff's insistence served as the initial, crucial catalyst. He demanded that the world recognize the extraordinary burdens carried by seemingly ordinary men like Clarence. Clarence Moyer, the reluctant participant, dreamed only of returning home to the simple normalcy of roller skating. He was abruptly thrust into a position of direct, lethal responsibility. His promotion to gunner was a life sentence to the claustrophobic, oil and gunpowder-scented confines of the turret. He was now the man who pulled the lanyard. He was the one tasked with the instantaneous decision to take a life. The strategic importance of blocking the German retreat at Mons, Belgium, meant the 3rd Armored Division was deployed to lay ambushes. This was a desperate, high-stakes game of cat and mouse. The psychological pressure on Clarence during his first combat engagement was immense. Positioned in the darkness on the twilight of September 2, 1944, he was paralyzed by the moral weight of firing on an unseen enemy. His hesitation was a profound moment of internal conflict. It was the last flicker of his pre-war humanity, fighting the soldier he was being forced to become. It took the pragmatic, authoritative voice of his commander, Staff Sergeant Paul Fairclough, to shatter that hesitation. Fairclough commanded, "Somebody has to take the shot." That moment, guided by the distinctive sound of German full-metal tracks, marked Clarence's forced baptism by fire. It resulted in the destruction of an enemy Panzer IV. The following morning, the fight intensified. But it was the tragic fate of Paul Fairclough that truly defined Clarence's transformation. After their Sherman was hit, its gun barrel damaged and threatening a catastrophic backblast, Fairclough's courage shone through. He moved through the smoke to aid a burning Greyhound crew. He was only to be struck down by a mortar attack that shattered his arm and blew off his leg. The sight of his commander grievously wounded, suffering a loss that was both physical and existential, immediately replaced Clarence's shock and grief with a visceral, protective fury. Thrust into command, he instinctively began a sustained, relentless firing of the coaxial machine gun. He was repelling the renewed German assault. This rapid, traumatic transition from hesitant gunner to furious commander illustrated the immense psychological strain placed on these young soldiers. It revealed the chaotic, deeply personal nature of conflict. The ensuing battle secured a swift and decisive victory. It culminated in the capture of 27,000 German troops at Mons. This massive interception, a swift destruction of a large force according to the 3rd Armored Division history, prevented critical German reinforcement of the West Wall. It was a strategic triumph, but it was one achieved through the crucible of individual psychological breakdown and forced maturation. By focusing on Clarence's internal struggle, his reluctance, his trauma, and his instantaneous grief-fueled command, the narrative implicitly challenges the idea of war as a sterile strategic game between generals. It underscores instead that the fate of nations often rests on the difficult, impossible choices made by young men in the face of unimaginable horror. The Battle of the Bulge was Hitler's desperate, last-ditch gamble. It was a furious rejection of defeat that shattered the Allied illusion of a swift end to the war. The initial German success was not just tactical. It was a profound psychological shock. Launched through the lightly defended, frozen forests of the Ardennes, the offensive achieved its surprise through meticulous secrecy. It created an 86-mile wedge in the Allied lines. GIs, caught completely off guard, were thrust into desperate defensive stands. They baffled not only the shock of a renewed enemy, but also the brutal, unforgiving winter. Temperatures hovered near zero. This turned the inside of a Sherman tank into a freezing metal tomb, an igloo without a heater. For the exhausted men, survival became the non-ideological imperative, overriding all strategic thought. This renewed German ferocity and the subsequent high casualty rate laid bare the catastrophic inadequate imperative, Batastrophica. The public outcry was immediate and fierce. It was fueled by headlines that screamed, "Nazi tanks excel ours." In the claustrophobic confines of the turret, the men of the 3rd Armored Division understood this truth intimately. Their 75mm guns often amounted to little more than nuisances against the hardened steel of the German Panthers. The cost of this disparity was paid in blood and burning steel. 2 months into the grinding fight, in the harsh snow and cold of early February 1945, the advance felt like a cruel, unending test. The terrain itself was treacherous. The strained supply lines only contributed to the German desperation and the necessary American caution. On February 8th, the company found itself pushing forward again. But their lead tank, Eleanor, struck a mine hidden beneath the snowdrifts near the German town of Stolberg. The violent explosion was a shocking start to the day. Bill Hay, Eleanor's commander, exhibited profound courage. He dismounted to inspect the minefield himself. This grim commitment forced the company to advance despite the treacherous conditions. The decision to proceed proved fatal. Soon after, Eleanor engaged an enemy tank. In the ensuing confrontation, Bill Hay was killed, and his Sherman was destroyed. The M4 variant, with its vulnerable placement of shells and gallons of gasoline, was notoriously prone to turning into a raging inferno. The Germans cruelly nicknamed it the Ronson Lighter. Chuck, Eleanor's gunner, ordered the crew to bail out into the chaos. He concealed a bloody nose, smashed against the periscope in the blast. This was a small, desperate act of toughness that masked the terror of the moment. The loss of Hay and Eleanor underscored the high price paid for every mile gained. It solidified the military's recognition that the American tanker was fighting a technologically disadvantaged war. The immense losses suffered in the Ardennes, the 3rd Armored Division, alone having lost 163 tanks, created a political and military crisis. The answer was not just more tanks, but a revolutionary one. The persistent threat of superior German armor finally forced the deployment of the M26 Pershing. This super tank represented a massive technological leap. With its monstrous 90mm cannon, automatic transmission, and twice the effective armor of the Sherman, the Pershing was designed to restore parity. The first 40 had just come off the assembly line, 20 were rushed to Europe. The psychological boost was immediate. It was a tangible sign that the industrial might of the United States was finally delivering a machine capable of standing toe-to-toe with the enemy's best. The deployment of the Pershing was a direct acknowledgement that individual bravery, while crucial, could not perpetually overcome the tactical challenge presented by German engineering. The war was far from over, but the eventual Allied counteroffensive, spearheaded by forces like the 3rd Armored, successfully reversed the Bulge. This massive effort was the largest battle ever fought by the US Army. It ultimately depleted Germany's remaining resources and manpower. It paved the way for the final bloody push into the German heartland. It demonstrated that even faced with a technologically superior foe, the resilience of the Allied soldiers and the overwhelming industrial capacity of the United States would, in the end, prevail. The relentless American advance, a grinding, mile-by-mile process, pushed the 3rd Armored Division deeper into the German homeland. The strategic goal was the industrial heartland, the Ruhr, and the symbolic, vital city of Cologne. This drive, however, was no triumphal parade. It was characterized by the brutal, localized reality of combined arms warfare. Every hedge, every farmhouse, and every crossroads concealed a potential ambush. The American Shermans, despite their numbers, remained tragically outmatched. German 88mm anti-tank guns, formidable tank killers capable of firing 20-pound shells over 6 miles, exploited the Shermans' vulnerabilities with devastating efficiency. The casualties mounted. With them, the psychological strain on the tank crews also mounted. Captain Salisbury, witnessing the unsustainable losses, was forced to make a decisive shift in operational doctrine. He recognized that individual acts of courage, while inspiring, could no longer compensate for technological disparity. Salisbury began to prioritize the newly arrived Pershing tanks as the spearhead. He deployed them as shock troops to breach entrenched positions. It was a clear, if silent, acknowledgement that the war had changed. Only superior firepower could ensure the breakthrough. This tactical pivot coincided with a profound and irreversible collapse of German morale. As the Allied forces converged, the promises of Nazi propaganda dissolved into the smoke and ruin of the fatherland. The relentless fighting and catastrophic casualties had stripped away the veneer of ideological fervor. It was replaced with a weary desperation. German soldiers, often young boys or old men pressed into service, found themselves fighting not for victory, but often for a few more hours of life. The psychological damage was compounded by the devastating shift in civilian sentiment. The German people, worn down by years of bombing and now facing invasion, began to view their own fighting men not as heroes, but as prolongers of the war. This scorn, coupled with the pervasive fear of informers, created a profound breakdown of morale. It left many German soldiers questioning the futility of their final bloody stand. For young German Private Gustav Schäfer, this growing sense of doom was crippling. He carried with him not just the immediate terror of combat, but the chilling memory of Kristallnacht from his youth. He remembered the sight of his father's tearful return after witnessing the synagogue's destruction. That early trauma, a premonition of the moral collapse of his country, now amplified the futility of his present situation. He and his comrades, sharing dark humor and rationed drinks in a seemingly untouched Heidelberg brewery, were acutely aware of the chasm between propaganda and reality. The Pershing, the American answer to the Panther, began to justify Salisbury's faith. Near Cologne, the Pershing crew, led by Clarence Moyer, faced a heavily defended German position that had stalled the entire advance. Traditional armor-piercing rounds were failing against the entrenched defenses. In a moment of tactical innovation, Clarence ordered the use of white phosphorus shells. The resulting firestorm, a blinding eruption of burning chemicals, cleared the defenses and allowed the American advance to continue. The aftermath was grim, but the breakthrough was achieved, underscoring the limitations of the older Shermans and the necessity of the Pershing's formidable 90mm gun. As Task Force X neared the outskirts of Cologne, the strategic city stood as a physical and psychological barrier. The iconic cathedral, though blackened, still dominated the skyline above the ruins. The advance came to a tense halt at a major thoroughfare. The immediate proximity of intense urban combat was signaled by a heavy, foreboding gate. The gate was completely blocked by debris and rubble. It was a clear, tangible barrier, forcing the men to prepare for the house-to-house, block-by-block fight that lay ahead. The battle for Cologne, once it began, was defined by desperate, localized resistance. The enemy was no longer just the trained Wehrmacht soldier, but anyone capable of wielding a weapon. The unpredictability of the urban environment was immediately apparent. American scout Buck Marsh, advancing cautiously towards an underpass, encountered a seemingly harmless German couple. With chilling adaptability, the pair suddenly attacked his reconnaissance with a potent Panzerfaust. This was the single-shot anti-tank weapon that had become the signature of Germany's last-ditch defense. This moment, where the line between civilian and combatant dissolved into lethal chaos, demonstrated the changing, brutal nature of warfare. It was a stark departure from the conventional battles of earlier months. It forced the American soldiers to confront a new, more insidious kind of terror. The final hours of the Battle of Cologne were less a tactical engagement and more a desperate, chaotic scramble. The collapse of German command had been total. The SS were nowhere to be seen. They had abandoned the city to the Volkssturm, old men and terrified boys armed with ancient rifles, and the remaining exhausted Wehrmacht. The few tanks left on the Rhine's western bank, outmoded Mark IVs and scarred Panthers, were fighting with their backs to the wall. This grim reality was sealed by a distant, gut-shaking explosion. The Germans had destroyed the Hohenzollern Bridge, cutting off the last viable escape route. The sound reverberated through the ruins. It was a massive final acknowledgement that the defense was over. Anyone left was now expendable. For the American forces, it was a grim signal that their death march was still on. The objective was shifting from capturing Cologne to seizing the Rhine itself. Amidst the financial district, the fighting was distilled into brutal, close-quarters encounters. The psychological strain was immense. The enemy was unseen until the moment of lethal contact. American soldiers Robert Morris, who carried the image of his wife and daughter in his mind, and Richard Bourne were tracking a sniper in an abandoned flower shop when they were cut down. Their lives were extinguished in the swift, unforgiving chaos of urban combat. Their deaths served as a chilling reminder that no corner was safe. The line between caution and aggression was measured in milliseconds. The final stand of the German armour centred on a strategically placed Panther tank. Its commander, Second Lieutenant Wilhelm Bartelborth, was a determined man. He had positioned his formidable machine to dominate a critical intersection. Anticipating the standard American approach, he had his turret already aimed down an empty street. But American tank commander Early, having seen too many good men lost to conventional tactics, devised a plan to blindside the heavy armour. Combat cameraman Jim Bates, driven by a documentary impulse that transcended the danger, positioned his lens to capture the impending duel. The American Pershing, Eagle 7, crewed by Early, Clarence Smoyer, and their comrades, rumbled into the intersection. The Panther's gun was already swinging toward them. Clarence, the Pershing's gunner, reacted instantly. He fired a T-33 armor-piercing shell. The Pershing's monstrous 90mm cannon finally met its intended adversary. The round slammed into the Panther's engine bay. More impacts followed, punching through the hull. The German tank exploded, roaring like a blowtorch. A fiery geyser of smoke and ash rose into the shattered Cologne skyline, reminiscent of Mount Vesuvius. It was a pivotal moment. It was a fiery testament to the Pershing's effectiveness and a desperately needed morale boost for the tired American tankers. But triumph was immediately tempered by the unseen costs. Clarence was left grappling with the moral implications of the destruction he had wrought. The burning wreck was a symbol of the butchery he wished to escape. His mind flashed back to the previous day's tragedy. He remembered the black Opel P4, mistakenly identified as an enemy vehicle in the crossfire. He remembered the subsequent deaths of the civilian driver, Michael Delling, and the young woman, Katharina Esser. The realization that his actions had caused the death of innocents settled heavily upon him. It was a guilt that would fester for decades. On the German side, the sight of the burning Panther, combined with the news of the bridge's destruction, broke Gustav Schaefer, positioned in his outmoded Mark IV, awaiting an American force that felt overwhelming and inevitable. He felt a crushing sense of abandonment. What were they owed anymore? He believed they were simply sent to die. The senselessness of continuing the fight overwhelmed his sense of duty. He made a profound, personal choice for self-preservation. He abandoned his tank. Staff Sergeant Rolf Militer, Gustav's pragmatic commander, whose family had been lost in the Dresden firestorm, chose to follow. For Rolf, who had nothing left to lose, fighting to the bitter end had seemed a good way to die. But now, seeing the final futile collapse, he recognized the senselessness and followed Gustav into the ruins. As the battle subsided, the human complexities of the conquered city began to emerge. American scout Buck Marsh, navigating the debris-strewn streets, encountered German tankers Gustav and Rolf surrendering. Their primary concern was the state of their uniforms. The surrender, rather than a moment of ideological confrontation, was one of weary, shared humanity. Buck's earlier encounter with Annemarie Berghoff and her family took on deeper significance. She revealed the Gestapo's brutality. Her mother had been arrested and put on trial for simply asking a question. Cologne, Buck realized, was not a monolith of Nazi fervor. Many of its citizens were themselves victims, living in fear and longing for the war to end. The capture of Cologne was a massive strategic gain, but the cost was immense. The city stood as a ruin, the blackened cathedral a silent headstone. Soldiers, seeking any semblance of normalcy or escape, descended into the cellar of the Dom Hotel. They found looted wine and briefly tried to forget the smell of burning rubber and gunpowder. In a moment of reckless camaraderie, Buck and Janicki even risked a joyride on a seized motorcycle. The final battle, while decisive, had laid bare the psychological toll of urban warfare. It left survivors deeply scarred. Their youthful identities were replaced by a profound wariness, yet they clung to the enduring hope for connection and a return to simple pleasures like roller skating. The final high-stakes drive of the 3rd Armored Division, the American Blitz, was less a strategic advance and more a sustained high-speed delirium. The objective was the Ruhr, the industrial heart of Germany. The orders demanded speed above all else. It was a reckless, high-risk maneuver intended to trap hundreds of thousands of German troops. The task forces, sometimes comprising over 150 vehicles, tore across the German countryside. They achieved what was lauded as the greatest one-day advance in the history of mobile warfare, covering over 100 miles in 24 hours. Yet this speed was a dangerous illusion of safety. The High Command, believing victory was contagious, pushed forward with aggressive confidence. General Maurice Rose, the commander of the 3rd Armored, embodied this frontline philosophy. He personally led his division in a Greyhound armored car, his staff and stenographer trailing behind. This close proximity to the fighting proved fatal. Near Paderborn, a key hub for German armored training, the general's entourage stumbled into a final desperate ambush by a German Tiger tank. Rose's car was disabled. In the ensuing chaos, he and his men were cut off. They were eventually captured. In a chilling display of the enemy's final, brutal tenacity, they were executed by the Tiger tank crew. The loss of General Rose was more than a strategic setback. It was a profound psychological blow. For Clarence Moyer, the news was a stark, visceral reminder that the war granted no exceptions. No one, not even a 2-star general, was untouchable. The cost of this relentless push was immediately visible. Easy Company, on a rescue mission the morning after the ambush, encountered the devastation later known as the Wellborn Massacre. 37 American vehicles lay along the road, scorched and broken. It was a testament to the devastating effectiveness of German Panzerfausts and flak guns used against ground targets. The carnage left Clarence scanning the woods. The dangerous illusion of American invincibility was permanently shattered. Paderborn, the target of Spearhead's last major fight, proved to be a crucible of tenacious, often fanatical resistance. The city, home to the SS Armour School, was fiercely defended by determined German soldiers who fought with a fatalistic resolve. The intensity of the engagement at the rail yard forced the infantry, including the terrified rookies, into a desperate close-quarters brawl. The death of Lieutenant Boom elevated Buck Marsh, the hesitant scout, into a position of command. It thrust him into the grim necessity of leading the remaining men from the besieged switch house. The building's walls were being steadily chewed apart by relentless machine gun fire. This final, costly battle where Easy Company's strength was cut in half challenged every notion of an easy victory. The American Sherman tanks, their 76mm shells bouncing harmlessly off superior German armor, struggled to provide support. It was the Pershing, the supertank, that finally broke the armored threat. Clarence, under immense pressure, used his 90mm gun to destroy the formidable Panther, securing the rail yard. Yet, the victory was instantly tempered by the moral choices of survival. As the German Panther crew bailed out, Clarence held his finger on the coaxial machine gun trigger, watching the young driver flee. In that decisive moment, he chose not to fire. He refused to become the kind of killer he fought against. His act of mercy was mirrored hours later near a knocked-out Tiger tank. A scene of brutal revenge unfolded as American tankers began assaulting a captured German commander. Buck intervened, but it was Byron, one of his comrades, who stopped the violence. He revealed that this German officer had once saved his life from execution. The strain of the war, the clash between duty and humanity, proved too much for Byron. The weight of the conflict finally broke him. It led to a profound emotional collapse that underscored the deep psychological toll exacted on every surviving soldier. The capture of Paderborn sealed the trap. The sealing of the Ruhr pocket represented a critical, decisive blow. It trapped over 325,000 German troops. This victory, achieved at such a high human cost, crippled the German forces. It paved the way for the final conclusion of the war in Europe. The American advance continued eastward. But the strategic decision had already been made. The American forces would halt at the Elbe River. This halt, designed to avoid unnecessary casualties and respect prior agreements, was not merely tactical. It was a crucial geopolitical consequence of the American Blitz. It ensured that the final link-up would occur with the Soviet Red Army. It established the future lines of influence that would define the post-war world. For the exhausted, traumatized men of the Third Armored, the fight was over. But the emotional war had just begun. The war refused to stay buried. For Clarence Smoyer, the end of the conflict was not a cessation of fighting but a metastasis of trauma. The corrosive guilt from the destruction of the Panther and the death of the civilians in Cologne became a permanent fixture in his psyche. He lived with severe PTSD. The anxiety was a constant hum beneath the surface of his life. It manifested in nightmares where the fire of the burning German tank was always too close. He had tried to outrun the 3rd Armored Division, seeking anonymity in the quiet normalcy of post-war life. But the images, the smells, and the sounds remained immediate. On the opposing side, Gustav Schaefer carried a different yet equally devastating burden. The shock of defeat and the physical hardship of his time as a prisoner of war were compounded by a profound moral awakening. When he was finally shown the newsreels of the concentration camps, the skeletal figures, the piles of bodies, the scale of the Nazi regime's evil became terrifyingly real. The early horror he had witnessed as a boy during Kristallnacht now found its terrifying completion. This moral reckoning, coupled with the psychological toll of fighting a futile war, ensured that his psychological scars were deep and enduring. The fragile peace Clarence had constructed around himself finally fractured in the mid-1990s. The catalyst was a seemingly innocuous VHS tape titled Skeins of War. Watching the grainy, decades-old footage, he saw the moment of the urban crossfire. He saw the black Opel P4 driven by Michael Delling and the young woman, Kathy Esser, caught in the devastating blast. The images were not abstract reports of death. They were vivid, undeniable proof of the human cost of his instantaneous decisions. The question that had haunted him for 50 years, did I kill her? He knew with absolute clarity that only by confronting the past, by seeking out the man he had fought against, could he ever find peace. This quest for reconciliation was underpinned by the tireless dedication of a handful of historians and journalists. Men like Herman Rheindorf, Mark Hieronymus, and the author Adam Makos committed themselves to what felt like impossible detective work. They consulted with armor gurus who could discern the difference between a shell impact from a 75mm and a 90mm cannon. They waded through desk-swallowing mounds of history in archives across Europe and America. They meticulously pieced together the paper trail of Task Force X and the remnants of Panzer Brigade 106. The difficulty of locating a single aging German tanker decades after the war was immense, but the commitment to factual accuracy and human closure drove the effort. Finally, after years of search,